The tube is still down there, not the system. The system was dismantled, the station sealed, the machinery stripped and sold, but sections of the original brick tunnel, bored beneath Broadway in 1897, remain beneath the street. The city did not remove them, it simply stopped talking about them. For 30 years, the United States Post Office ran a fully operational pneumatic mail network underneath the streets of Manhattan. Not a prototype, not a pilot program, a working infrastructure, tunnels, dispatch stations, cylindrical carriers, air pressure systems that moved hundreds of thousands of mail pieces per day through a city that had no viable alternative for rapid surface delivery. Broadway was gridlocked by horse-drawn traffic. The streets were loud, slow, and unpredictable. Underground, the mail moved at 35 miles per hour. The system launched in 1897 and operated continuously until 1953. It ran beneath 8 routes, connected 23 pneumatic stations, and at its peak, processed roughly 30,000 mail pouches per day across 27 miles of tunnel. The engineering journals of the period called it one of the most efficient urban mail systems ever built. Then, Congress defunded it. No public referendum, no infrastructure review published in full, no formal inquiry into what would replace it. The Appropriations Committee cut the funding in a budget cycle, and the tubes went silent. The postal workers who had operated the system for decades were reassigned. The dispatch stations, some of them architectural gems, tiled and vaulted, were sealed. The official explanation was cost. The system was expensive to maintain. Surface delivery had improved. The math no longer worked. What the record is quieter about is the timing and the math that was actually being done in the years just before the shutdown. Here is what the system actually looked like. The pneumatic mail network beneath Manhattan was not an experiment borrowed from Europe and half-heartedly applied to American conditions. It was a purpose-built infrastructure, engineered specifically for the density and volume of New York City's postal traffic. The tunnels ran at a diameter of approximately 30 inches, large enough for the cylindrical mail carriers, small enough to maintain the air pressure differential that propelled them. The carriers moved on a cushion of compressed air, dispatched from stations that functioned like post offices with a second operation running entirely below street level. The stations themselves were not hidden. They were integrated into existing post office buildings across Manhattan, at Grace Station on Broadway, at the General Post Office on 8th Avenue, at Church Street, at Madison Square. Postal workers loaded carriers at street level, fed them into the tubes below, and tracked their movement through a dispatch system that, by the standards of 1910, was remarkably precise. A mail piece entered the tube at one station and emerged at another in under 10 minutes. Across a city where a horse-drawn mail wagon could spend 40 minutes covering the same distance in surface traffic, 10 minutes was the difference between a functional postal system and a failing one. The volume numbers are documented in Post Office Department annual reports. By the early 1920s, the system was processing mail for some of the highest density commercial corridors in the world: the financial district, the garment district, the publishing corridor along Lower Broadway. The businesses that depended on rapid mail delivery, banks, insurance companies, law firms, trading houses, were not peripheral users. They were the economic core of the city. And here is where the bridge of relevance holds. Because the experience of losing infrastructure you never voted for, built on a timeline you had no input into, serving an economy you participated in but did not control, is not a historical abstraction. It is the operational description of how most urban infrastructure decisions have always worked. The pneumatic mail system was never put to a public vote when it was built. It was never put to a public vote when it was shut down. The people it served most directly, the postal workers, the businesses, the residents of the neighborhoods whose streets it ran beneath, were not consulted in either direction. The funding history is where the record becomes instructive. The pneumatic mail system operated on annual congressional appropriations. Each year, the Post Office Department submitted a budget that included operating costs for the tube system. Each year, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Congress approved those costs, sometimes with friction, sometimes with efficiency debates attached, but consistently enough that the system ran without interruption for 5 decades. The friction increased after 1945. Historians note that the post-war period brought a significant reorganization of American transportation infrastructure priorities. The federal highway program was gaining political momentum. The trucking industry, which had expanded dramatically during the war, was positioning itself as the backbone of American freight and delivery logistics. Archival patterns suggest that the lobbying presence of surface transportation interests in congressional budget discussions grew substantially in the late 1940s. The Post Office Department's own internal documents from this period show an agency under pressure to justify the tube system's cost against surface alternatives that were presenting as cheaper, in part because the infrastructure investment required to support them was being absorbed by separate federal programs rather than appearing as a line item in the postal budget. This was not a neutral comparison. A pneumatic tunnel has visible maintenance costs. A truck running on a federally subsidized highway does not carry the highway construction cost in its operating budget. The comparison that Congress was being asked to make in the late 1940s was not an apples-to-apples evaluation of two delivery systems. It was a comparison between a self-contained infrastructure with transparent costs and a surface system whose costs were distributed across multiple federal accounts. The record does not show that this distinction was prominently raised in the appropriations discussions that preceded the shutdown. The pneumatic stations are sealed, but the postal employment records from this period are not. If someone in your life worked the Manhattan tube system or is trying to trace why a family member's postal career ended abruptly in 1953, send this to them. The dispatch logs still exist. What the Post Office Department's final operational reports show is a system that was, by the metrics it had always been measured against, still functioning. Delivery times were within historical norms. Equipment failure rates were not elevated. The 1952 annual report, 1 year before the shutdown, records no operational crisis, no safety incident, no infrastructure failure that would have warranted emergency closure. The system was not shut down because it stopped working. The shutdown date was June 30th, 1953. Not a gradual phase-out, not a transition period with parallel operations while surface alternatives were tested and verified. 1 fiscal year ended. The appropriation was not renewed, and the system stopped. Postal workers who had reported to tube stations for decades showed up on July 1st to reassigned positions. The carriers sat in the tunnels. The air pressure systems were depressurized. The dispatch logs were closed. And here is where the record gets strange. The congressional debate that preceded the 1953 shutdown was not a major legislative event. It did not generate the kind of documented back and forth that significant infrastructure decisions typically produce. There was no Senate hearing record running to hundreds of pages. There was no commissioned study comparing pneumatic delivery costs against surface alternatives on equivalent terms. The appropriations discussion was brief, the kind of brief that happens when a decision has already been made in rooms that don't generate transcripts. Historians note that the formal record of the shutdown decision is thin relative to the scale of what was being discontinued. A system that had moved mail beneath Manhattan for 56 years, that had processed hundreds of millions of mail pieces, that had employed hundreds of postal workers across 24 stations, was ended in a budget line. The Post Office Department did not publish a post-shutdown analysis. The question of what would replace the tube system's capacity, specifically how the volume it had been handling would be absorbed by surface delivery without degrading service times in the financial district and lower Manhattan, does not appear to have been formally answered before the closure. Archival patterns suggest the answer came later and incrementally and not entirely satisfactorily. Surface delivery times in Manhattan's high-density commercial corridors in the late 1950s show, in Post Office Department annual reports, a measurable increase over the tube system's benchmarks. The system that replaced pneumatic delivery was slower. The record says so directly. And then, buried in the procurement records of the early 1950s, there is something else. In the years immediately preceding the shutdown, the Post Office Department had entered into a series of contracts with private trucking companies for surface mail delivery services in New York City. The contracts were awarded through the standard procurement process. They appear in the Federal Register. They are not hidden. What they are is specific. The companies named in those contracts, the routes assigned, the volumes projected, the rates negotiated, represent a surface delivery capacity that was being built out. Before, the pneumatic system was officially declared uneconomical. The infrastructure to replace the tubes was being contracted while the tubes were still running. This does not prove a predetermined outcome. What it does prove is that the decision was not made the way the official record implies, as a reactive budget calculation responding to rising maintenance costs. The surface alternative was being assembled in parallel. The pneumatic system was being evaluated against a replacement that was already under contract. The archive knew the answer before it asked the question. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next investigation goes beneath a different city and finds a different kind of silence. Now consider what happened to the stations. The 23 pneumatic dispatch stations beneath Manhattan were sealed after 1953. Some were incorporated into existing post office basements. Some were simply bricked over. The City Record, New York's official municipal publication, contains no systematic accounting of what was done with the tunnel infrastructure, which sections were removed, which remain. Indications point to significant portions of the original 1897 brickwork still being present beneath Broadway and Lafayette Street. The question the record leaves open is not whether the system could have continued operating. The question is why the record of its ending was kept so deliberately thin. A 56-year infrastructure, one of the most sophisticated urban mail systems ever built, was discontinued without a public hearing, without a published impact assessment, without a formal answer to the question of what would carry its volume. The archive does not explain this. It simply stops. New York is not the only city that has done this. The pneumatic mail network beneath Manhattan is one of the better documented cases of infrastructure discontinuation in American urban history. Precisely because the tunnel brickwork survived, because the postal records were voluminous enough to outlast the agency's interest in preserving them prominently, and because the gap between what the shutdown record says and what the procurement record shows is specific enough to be legible. Most cases are not this legible. The pattern the pneumatic mail story traces is not unique to the Postal Service or to the 1950s or to New York. A public infrastructure is built without a public vote. It operates for decades, serving a constituency that comes to depend on it without ever being formally asked whether it should exist. Then, a budget decision, made in a process that generates minimal documentation, evaluated against alternatives whose true costs are distributed across other accounts, ends it. The constituency that depended on it is not consulted. The record of the decision is thin. The replacement is slower. This sequence does not require conspiracy to operate. It requires only the normal functioning of institutions that make large decisions in small rooms on compressed timelines with asymmetric information and aligned interests. What makes the pneumatic mail case worth returning to is the specificity of what survives in the archive. The procurement contracts, the annual reports with the delivery time benchmarks, the appropriations discussions whose brevity is itself a data point, the tunnel sections that are still, according to indications in city infrastructure surveys, present beneath the street. The record did not disappear. It was not buried. It was simply never assembled into the form that would have made the question obvious. That is the work this channel does. Not to assert what the record proves beyond what it actually shows, but to assemble what the record contains and let the shape of it speak. The pneumatic mail network ran beneath Manhattan for 56 years. It moved hundreds of millions of pieces of mail through a city that had no better alternative. It was shut down without a public hearing, replaced by a slower system, and sealed beneath streets that most New Yorkers walk above every day without knowing it was ever there. The tube is still down there. The record always was.